we are really, really excited to be here to support Raj in this wonderful opportunity to present his proposal. He's been working long and hard. He's been diligently working on feedback and providing good quality turnaround. And so we are at the point where we can actually present. So at this point, this is what I'm going to do. Raj, we are going to mute ourselves. Most of the time, just depending on what's going on, we usually turn off our camera too. Mm-hmm. But I explained to you, we're always right here, mm-hmm. but it's to make sure that you're not pixelated. It doesn't mess up your presentation, because mm-hmm. this is all, not to make you self-conscious. This is all about you. Yeah. And so what we will do is we will listen and watch your presentation. Mm-hmm. We will not ask questions until the end, so we don't break your stride of mm-hmm. what you're going through. And then at the end, we will engage in an academic discussion about your topic and maybe any kind of possible concerns or questions that we have. You will respond, and at that point, I will then put you in a waiting room at the end when there are no more questions. We will discuss amongst ourselves as your committee. We will bring you back and give you our response. Awesome. It is then at that point, if there is a pass, we will go ahead and ask you to, in your handbook, there is a proposal defense appendices page that you need to fill out, because we need to sign.
Got it. Okay.
And you will send that to us.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Awesome. All right, now, another thing of why I'm going to mute myself, people are mowing. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, but I'm going to say, Raj, take it away.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you all so much for your time and your feedback, of course, that brought me to this part of my dissertation phase. So my dissertation is titled The Impact of Self-Efficacy on Urban Elementary School Teachers' Abilities to Identify and Address Fallout Amongst Children Caused by the COVID-19 Pandemic. So our agenda for today is going to be as follows. We're going to start off with the literature review, and I'm specifically going to talk about the gap that is related to my study. Then we're going to go into the theoretical framework that guides my study. Then we'll talk about the problem and purpose, the research questions, and then we'll go into the methodology and then a Q&A session. So as we all know, back in December of 2019, the coronavirus started spreading in Wuhan, China, and in February of 2020, the World Health Organization officially named it COVID-19. Initially, children weren't impacted by COVID-19 in terms of symptoms at first. However, they were impacted because in March of 2020, over 90% of students, not just in the United States, not just in a specific state, but worldwide, had to quarantine, and therefore education as a whole was put on hold for a little bit. Young children are continuing to experience fallout as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we are at the point now where there's quarantines happening mid-school year for a couple of weeks, a couple of days. Students may be quarantining as a cohort, as an individual. So the impacts are continuing even though we're in 2022 at this point. So when we think about the gap specifically, the starting point I'd start at is teachers. So teachers are in a very strong position to observe the impacts of anything that happens in students, because most of the time students are in school. And what's very interesting about that is that there's scant research on how teachers perceive their role to identify and address fallout or any type of adverse impact that students may receive, whether it be because of trauma, because of food shortage, because of economic issues. So this is not only something that's been researched very scantly before 2020 and before the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's actually something that is very true, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, because there's not been a lot of research for both how teachers identify and address impacts as well as adverse impacts or fallout, but also how they do so in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we all know, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is, as of now, according to literature, going to be lasting for a very long period of time. So children are, there's an increase in the amount of fallout and that they're experiencing. So it's important for us as scholars, as teachers, to understand how teachers perceive it. And like I said, that's because teachers spend most of their time with kids because kids are in school. So the theoretical framework that I'm going to be using is self-efficacy, and Albert Bandura's definition of self-efficacy from 1986 is self-efficacy is an individual's belief about his or her ability to manage events that affect his or her life. So in other words, it's the individual's belief in his or her capacity to essentially execute different types of tasks. And there's four sources or factors that impact self-efficacy. The first one is performance outcomes, and that amounts to if an individual has had past success, they will feel more competent. But if they have not had a lot of successes in the past, they may not feel competent. The second factor is vicarious experiences, and that impacts self-efficacy because based on how an individual, when they watch somebody else do a certain task and based on the outcomes of that individual, that might affect the individual's self-efficacy. Then we have verbal persuasion, which has to do with individuals if they're encouraged or discouraged. And then physiological feedback relates to bodily responses and emotional arousals that they experience when completing a task. And all of this is based on perception of the individual. So, an individual who has a low self efficacy typically lacks in self confidence in their capacity, and an individual who has a high self efficacy tends to be more confident. And then that brings us to our problem and purpose. So the problem of the study is that it is not known how the self-efficacy, and I'm focusing on performance outcomes and vicarious experiences, of elementary school teachers impacts their perceived ability to identify and deal with fallout amongst children in urban schools as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The purpose pretty much is very similar to the problem because they're both aligned. And then my two research questions that formulated are how does the self efficacy performance outcomes of elementary school teachers impact their perceived ability to identify and deal with fallout among students in urban schools as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? And my second research question is how does self efficacy vicarious experiences of elementary school teachers impact their perceived ability to identify and deal with fallout among students in urban schools as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? So that now that we kind of have a little bit of information pertaining to the literature and the gap, as well as the theoretical framework and the problem, purpose, and research questions, I'm going to go into the methodology. So the research design that I chose was a qualitative one. And I was kind of debating, as you probably remember, Dr. Bianchi Laubsch, in research methods during that course, if I should do a qualitative, a quantitative, or a mixed method study. And I decided to focus on, or to conduct a qualitative study because qualitative researchers are aware that like the world is not stable and it's predominantly based on perspective, and they really want to try to understand a phenomenon that's taking place. And then when I was looking at the different types of research methods, I decided to go and I'm deciding to like stick with descriptive phenomenology because that's the type of research where you really want to understand your participants' perspectives. You're not trying to quantify, you conduct interviews, and then that really helps understand the perspectives and their lived experiences as well. So then when we go into the sample and population, qualitative research usually involves about 20 participants, no more than that. And for descriptive phenomenology, they recommend the literature recommends between 6 to 10 participants to gain comprehensive data. As a result, I want to have between 8 to 10 participants. And when I actually try to recruit teachers and start interviewing teachers at a study site, I'll be using intensity sampling so that I could gain and so I could have a group that really represents the population of elementary school teachers. So elementary school is between kindergarten to fifth grade, and my goal is to have at least two teachers from each grade. So my data is not only focusing on like K to 2, which would be lower elementary, or 3 to 5, which would be the upper elementary school level. In terms of the instruments and data collection, so I'll be using questionnaires and structured interviews. Since we are in this new virtual 21st century world, I will be I'll be distributing my questionnaires via Google Form, and then I'm going to have structured interviews via Zoom. And the questionnaires from Google Form are going to kind of guide my interviews that I'm going to subsequently do. And interviews are purposeful, so I'm going to have a combination of structured as well as unstructured. I'm sorry, I was debating between structured and unstructured interviews, and then when I was looking at the two, I thought structured interviews would be better because you can use both divergent and convergent questions. Divergent questions are not open-ended, but convergent questions are. So for like the collateral information about how long a teacher has been teaching, how long or how many students they've had that might have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, those would be classified as convergent questions. But when I ask the open-ended questions that will really help me understand their experiences, that's where divergent questions will be used. And I will also be conducting a small scale implementation where I will interview some teachers as well as some, people that are in the field of education, and I'll give them the questionnaires as well as the structured interview to make sure that everything makes sense, it'll flow properly, and it's not going to be too much time that will be taken because I would like them to be between 40 minutes to an hour. And in terms of ethical considerations, all members of all like proposed subjects are going to receive informed consent, and that's going to contain a summary of the study that I'll be doing. They will also be given like a pseudonym, or they can provide me with a pseudonym that they'd like to use, and that's going to be helpful in building rapport, especially when conducting the structured interviews. And then afterwards, I'm going to have the transcripts verified by them, or I might summarize them so they can make sure that everything was transcribed correctly. And before I conduct any type of research, I'm definitely going to ask the IRB committee of William Howard Taft University to approve my data to make sure that once they review everything, I'm all good to go. Then the last step in terms of the data collection and analysis. So like I said, I'll be using Google Form and Zoom interviews, and the data that I received from that, I'm going to use in vivo to analyze everything. And specifically, I'll be using the Van Com approach, and that consists of several steps. The first one is bracketing, which involves me listening to the audios as well as transcribing it. Then I'm going to go on to the next step where I'll be isolating specific phrases that I feel are going to answer my two research questions. Then I'm going to go into the next step of trying to locate themes based on those phrases. And then once I identify themes, I'm going to go into the next step, which is making sure that the themes I identified actually are aligned to the data that I have. And then I'm going to define the themes by going back to the transcripts and trying to find actual quotes, as well as reviewing responses from the Google Form questionnaires. And then lastly, in terms of trustworthiness, transferability, dependability, and confirmability, which are very important for qualitative studies, each subject is going to receive the same set of questions. So that way there's somewhat of an alignment throughout. And that's going to be seen in both the Google Form questionnaires as well as during the Zoom interviews. When I created the questionnaires and the interviews, I had subject area experts review them. So there were about 4 educators that have experience between about 5 years all the way to 20 plus years of experience. Their education levels are a minimum a master's degree all the way to a PhD level. And they reviewed the different instruments, the 2 instruments that I'm planning on using, and they provided some feedback, and they at this point determined that it's totally appropriate. The teachers also they either are presently working in urban schools or they've had experience working in urban schools, and also they've worked in different settings like Catholic schools, schools in not just North America but also South America. So I had a broad range of areas of expertise with the individuals that served as subject area experts to review my research instruments. Then collaborative review of data is also important. So throughout, just like I did this time for the proposal, I'm going to speak with my chair, Dr. Skelton, as well as my committee members when I'm writing and when I'm creating the chapters 4 and 5 of my dissertation. And research and literature does affirm that when multiple people review a set of data and have and provide their interpretations, that's helpful in making the data more trustworthy, and that's something that I will definitely do. In terms of replicability, because I'm using um, best practices of qualitative research, it can be replicated in the future. And then something that I really have to be cognizant of is minimizing researcher bias. I'm going to do my best to be objective throughout the interviews. I'm not going to appear as judgmental. Since I'll be interviewing and they'll see my face, I'm going to do my best to just be a reporter of data and not act in a way that would make my research participants feel uncomfortable. I'll also not have themes in mind, which is I know something that you like gave some feedback about Dr. Rizzo, because there has been some research, but very, very minimal, involving this topic. So I have to make sure that like I don't have themes in mind based on those past research articles that I've read. And like I said, with the interviews, I'm going to have open ended questions, just like with the questionnaires, but having open ended questions will allow me to really understand the perspectives of my research participants and of the teachers, which is the essence of descriptive phenomenology. So before we go into questions, I just want to acknowledge all of you and say thank you. You know, Dr. Skelton, you've been a part of my dissertation journey since day one, and your enthusiasm is always, you know, appreciated and helpful when doing something so like life and I guess time consuming. And Dr. Bianchi Lausch, since research methods, you know, you always push my thinking with the different types of research methods and ideas, and you know, your help with the lit review. So I do appreciate that. And Dr. Rizzo, you were the last class I took before I started my dissertation, so you know, like all the like morale boost that you gave, and it's kind of I guess ironic that I'm doing self-efficacy because I feel like you strengthen my self-efficacy with all your great, you know, feedback. So appreciate that. Thumbs up. So I'll stop sharing. And should I make you host now, Dr. Skelton, or should I wait?
Yeah, that sounds great, actually. Okay. Thank you. Awesome. So
thank you.
With that, first off, very good presentation. I really appreciate that. Very thank professional. You. And I'm host again, yay. But what I would like to do is open it up right now to the committee members. Do y'all have any questions? Does anybody want to go first?
I had difficulty unmuting myself, of course. As you've already mentioned, I had you in class while you were preparing ideas for this study. So at that point, you answered a lot of my questions. So I don't have a whole lot for you right now. I did want to ask if you had considered any potential problems that may arise trying to conduct this study during COVID, such as the Zoom interviews and things like that. And how do you intend to handle some of those setbacks?
That is a real good question. So now that you bring it up, I mean, there could be connectivity issues. My study site is going to consist of teachers in Utah. So what I guess I'm going to do is on the questionnaires, I might add a question to put their phone number, and I'll explain like if there's some issue with Zoom, that we could continue the interview via phone, and then I'll continue recording it by putting my cell phone on speakerphone. So that's a good point.
Good. I honestly don't have any other questions for you because we've been through your study quite a bit, and then the questions I asked when you turned in your proposal, you answered as well. So I appreciate your thorough responses to my questions, and great job.
Thanks, and thanks for your feedback again.
So Raj, first of all, this is really a very timely, well-designed study. I think COVID once, and we will eventually get past this. This is going to be a gold mine for researchers for years to come. And it's going to be fascinating because I think the impacts of this are going to be with us for many, many years in the educational sector, not just K-12 either, but certainly in higher education. Question I have, and I know you're using in vivo and using qualitative descriptives, but my only concern is you might run into some teachers who have very different perspectives, not just for their students, but because of their personal experience with COVID. You know, some of them may have lost friends, family members, or have experienced COVID themselves. Is there any way you're going to try to take that in account? Because you're looking for their efficacy with students.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, and I get that piece, but is there any concern on your part? I guess let me ask it better. I wasn't really asking very clearly. Is there any concern on your part that you may be measuring something you really didn't set out to measure?
That is a good question. I was thinking that obviously, like, we all have our own biases based on whatever's going on, and I think if anything, that would, um, I guess, provide more information because I want to really understand their experiences, and their experiences as teachers can definitely be impacted by their family life and unfortunate deaths or whatever if they had COVID themselves. So that's something that I would not necessarily consider as a separate entity, but I think it would impact their self efficacy in terms of how they deal with children. I don't know if you have ideas also, but that's something that just at this moment is going through my mind that it could impact their experiences, could impact them.
I think that's a great answer. I don't really have the best way to do that myself. I'm just thinking that there's so many different aspects to COVID that one really has to be careful to make sure that you're really zeroing in on that which you're trying to get a hold of. Another question I had, and forgive me, I don't have your proposal in front of me, but I certainly did read it. You've used the word fallout several times.
Mm-hmm.
Did you define fallout for us? I'm trying to remember. What exactly are you talking about?
So initially I was thinking about focusing just on trauma, but I realized that that's one type of fallout. There's so many different types of fallout that COVID has caused, not just trauma. So I brought into my study even more. There's financial hardships when we're thinking of students who may not have been getting free or reduced lunch, and that's something, in an urban school setting, that's something we can consider in this study. I'm also going to be talking about the familial hardships and fallout that they might have experienced, like students who, according to research, who were in like foster care system or had family court involvement might not have been it might have been weird, like, transferring a child from mom to dad or from foster care back out of foster care if they were exposed. So there's different types of fallout, and I did go through the different type that has already been kind of studied and reviewed in the lit review.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Very good.
Thank you.
Those are the only questions that I have.
Thanks.
But I have to unmute myself. Okay, so really good job. Now, I'm going to ask you something that's going to maybe be a little off the wall, but just to show transparency, how did you deal with, during this process of the proposal, the iterative process? Because like you said, we've been working on this for quite some time, and it was, you go from a point where you're like, yeah, you have a good idea, and then all of a sudden the academic questioning starts to come in. How did you deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Are you specifically referring to like the whole change from trauma to like making it more general?
That's a great example.
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely it's frustrating. I'm not going to lie, having to change everything up and then, find more literature when I'm like, oh, I'm finally done. But I think from reading the different types of topics, it wasn't as hard. I mean, yes, I had to write it, but in terms of finding the literature, like that's stuff that I was already reading about, kind of like what I was saying to Dr. Rizzo's question about the different types of fallout. So once I received that feedback about not just focusing on trauma, I think just given the way COVID is and the nature of the pandemic, I think it wasn't too difficult because it was very easy to just, I guess, use one factor or one fallout, which is trauma, and now broaden it to different types of fallout that could exist. You're muted, Doctor, if you're speaking.
Oh, sorry. My fingers were not as smooth as I had hoped. I think the biggest thing for me that I'm really impressed with, to be perfectly honest with you, is that it comes down to the way that you handled, not that that's adversity or how do I put this? It's academia, right? It's that debate. It's that scholarly debate back and forth. And we followed the right procedures. We talked to IRB. We talked about the possible concerns. Because in academia, even though we set ourselves up in one direction, later we start to realize, that once we put it into play, once we actually work towards that goal of collecting data, we can see potential issues. And so for us to be able to work together and to get a good way of how do we move forward, you handled it just super professionally. And if there were any frustrations, you never even shared it. So I'm just really, really
so in
proud.
that case, I wasn't frustrated then.
No. But what I'm saying is it's logical, right?
Right.
This is the first time that you've ever written something to this degree. And so it is growing pains in a way in which most people don't handle it with as much grace as you did. So I just wanted to brag on you for a moment in front of the committee. I'm very, very pleased with how you handled this. And I'll put it this way, sometimes I'm kind of tough. And just, here's how it is, and this is how research is, and you handled that very well. So I'm very pleased with not only this presentation, but your quality of work. So keep it up.
Thank you.
You also understood that when we were talking about how do you collect data, the phrase is bias. You kept saying different ways to describe it, but it's bias. How do you protect from bias?
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. You have to just sit there and listen and let the data come to you, and then you report the data. And for example, when people are talking about something as upsetting as losing family members and things like that, we don't want to stir any kind of trauma. We don't want to stir anything that could possibly emotionally upset them. And I think one of the things that you were talking about is to keep it as calm as possible and not overreact, not react, honestly. And therefore there's no overreaction, so people can kind of keep it calm. And that's very imperative. So you presented that very well. So for the most part, those were really, I had more comments than questions. I think because we've been working for a while, so you've answered all my questions for years now. But what I will say is really good job, very good presentation. If it's okay with everybody, may I put thumbs up or whatever? Can I put him in a timeout room? In a breakout room? I'll put you in a waiting room.
Awesome, thanks.
Here we go. Hey there.
Hi.
You are muted, but that's totally fine. We just wanted to take a moment and say congratulations. We believe that you have passed with no changes, and we are very pleased with your professionalism and your quality of work. Now, here are the feedback before we all say our congratulations even more. We wanted to say make sure that when you go collect the data, do it in a way that you have practiced before you actually go and do that, possibly with friends and family before you actually go to your participants. Make sure that you catch yourself with the verbal cues, with how slow you pace it. We want the interviews to be upwards of an hour, if not more. If you get 45 minutes or something, data is data. We will not cut that short. We will be grateful for what we get. But just so you can set the tone, in addition to that, when you get to the point of analysis and triangulation, call me so we can make sure that we do it properly. But otherwise, at this point in time, we're very pleased, and we all want to say congratulations.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Good work, Raj.
Thank you. Thanks.
Excellent. So we know we have some work to do with the paperwork to fill out. Committee, I can't thank you guys enough. I really appreciate y'all. Have a wonderful day. It's a Tuesday. See, I remembered. And you guys have a great afternoon.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.